Hey, Big Brains listeners, we're going to be taking a summer break during July. We will be back in August with all new episodes telling the stories of leading research with some of the world's greatest minds. During our break, we'll be bringing you updated versions of prior episodes, so make sure to tune in.
From the University of Chicago, this is Big Brains with Paul Rand. Conversations with pioneering thinkers that will change the way you see the world.
The human body is an amazing thing, but did you know that it's an ancient fish you actually have to thank for it? Neil Shubin is a University of Chicago paleontologist and evolutionary biologist. He's the best-selling author of Your Inner Fish, which is based on his groundbreaking 2006 discovery of Tiktaalik, the 375-million-year-old fossil that is considered a missing link between fish and humans. I talked with Neil about how he uncovered Tiktaalik in the Arctic Circle after decades of searching, and how that breakthrough is continuing to shape our understanding of human evolution. So, Neil, you've got quite an extraordinary history, and is discovery the right word?
Yeah, I'd like to think of it as discovery. Yes.
But it really, part of what we try to think about on Big Brains is something that is a pretty monumental insight or discovery that leads to the way people will end up seeing the world. And I think of the guests that we have that actually could say, this is really something that really does change the way you're likely to see the world. Yours really kind of falls smack in the middle of that, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, I'm interested in the big questions of the history of life. And, why does the world look the way it does? Why do our bodies look the way they do? And to that, we have to get to some really big discoveries, but also big issues, big ideas.
Right. So I wonder if we can just jump right into it. And there's quite a story about how you got to it, but can you just summarize what it is, the discovery or the finding that you had, and what it actually has led to in terms of thinkings?
So I've been interested pretty much throughout my entire career in the great transitions in the history of life. How did the big steps in evolution happen? And the one that I've been settling on for most of my career is the transition from fish to land-living animal. And the reason why I see it as a real first-class scientific problem is because, at first glance, it seems so utterly impossible. How did fish evolve to walk and breathe and feed on land? I mean, if you break it apart, it just doesn't seem like it could ever happen. But the reality is, as we discover fossils, as we look at genetics and DNA and embryos, that great transition becomes not only possible, but highly likely. And then it takes us some great ideas about how inventions happen in evolutionary history. So it really takes us to the origin of innovation. It takes us to the origin of the modern world. So discoveries lead us to big ideas.
Okay. So the discovery you had was actually a species, for lack of a better word, you called Tiktaalik.
Yeah, that was, that discovery was about 7 years in the making. What we wanted to do was find an intermediate between fish and land-living animal. And so we set off to think about where in the world could we find
and this
such
hadn't been done before.
People have tried. Yeah, people have definitely tried. But the record was getting more precise. So we hit this field at the right moment. That is, we had a very good idea of where in the world to look for this sort of thing, which seems strange. How do you do that? Well, what we did was we looked for places in the world that had rocks of the right age to hold a fossil like this, rocks in the world that had the right kinds of rocks to hold fossils. Not every kind of rock does do that. And finally, we needed rocks not only of the right age and the right type, but they had to be exposed to the surface. So with those notions, we looked at the world. We looked at maps of the world, geological surveys of the world, and it became very clear that the place that held rocks of the right age, type, and exposure were in the Canadian Arctic. So we spent 6 years looking for this thing. It's not easy. The Arctic's a huge place. These fossils are pretty small. So we had to fumble around for a little bit before we actually located the exact spot. But I'll never forget the day as long as I live. It was July of 2004. We were cracking rocks and we had identified a locality.
And then what's the temperature like as you're up there?
A little bit below freezing. I put it around 20 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay.
That's during the day. Well, it stayed like daylight 24 hours a day. But I mean, it's chilly and windy. Yep. Wind is the big thing that gets you. Yeah. And so we had, learned how to camp and live and lead a small crew up in these situations. There are polar bears up there. I mean, you're not only thinking about fossils, you're thinking about not getting eaten.
Right.
But we found a site that had lots of fossil bones. And I never forget the day as long as I live. One of my colleagues said, cracked a rock from this layer. And he said, hey guys, what's this? And as soon as I looked at it, I knew we had found the intermediate.
And what was the giveaway?
The giveaway was it was a fish, but it was a fish that had a particular kind of flat head, which is like early land-living animals. So I had staring at me the skull of a creature that looked part fish, part land-living animal. And what made it even better is as we pulled that skeleton out, we started to see other parts of the body. We started to see its fins, and its fin had arm bones and wrist bones inside. We started to see its body. It looked like it had both lungs and gills. It had a shoulder that looked like a cross between, fish and land-living animal. Here I had a wonderful intermediate between fish and land-living animal, found in exactly the right place.
That's extraordinary.
That we had predicted. It was a wonderful. It was funny. I was like, were you happy? People sometimes ask us. Yeah, I was happy, but I was just as much relieved as anything else.
That you found it.
Yeah, well, it took us 6 years. I was not doing so great before then.
Yep. Up until now, there was an assumption that there was a transition between fish and land animal?
Well, we had a very good idea that this transition happened based on other discoveries. We just didn't know the details the same way. We had species that had both lungs and gills in the past. We knew that there was a branch of the fish tree of life that was very closely related to us. What we were providing was important details. And it really was some details that tell us about how biological innovation, how biological inventions happen. When you think of technology, we talk about disruptive innovation, we talk about invention, and we talk about how that happens. Well, discoveries like this provide some important insights, and that's what this one really did. What it showed us was that many of the features that creatures use to live on land actually originally appeared in fish living in water. Whether it's fingers, whether it's lungs, whether it's arms, the list goes on and on. It's sort of the idea that inventions never happen at the time you think they did. They have many antecedents. So the idea was that these inventions actually happened in a different setting, and then it was that pre-adapted, pre-set up these creatures to make the great transition that they did. And that's the big idea here. The big idea is that inventions have long antecedents, and they arise at one point in time for one purpose, but it's usually not the purpose you originally associated with. And that's really exciting. And you can think about that for so many different features. Feathers. Think about feathers. They help birds fly. Well, if we look at the fossil record, it turns out feathers didn't originally appear for flight. They appeared in dinosaurs as a kind of ornamentation, whether it's to pick up mates, or to be received by mates.
No kidding. Okay.
Yeah. And so we're seeing this again and again. This is not just an exemplar of the transition from fish to land-living animal. It's a basic feature of invention in the biological world.
But is the assumption as you talk about this that there, up until Tiktaalik, that there were no creatures that were on land? Or is this something that showed how they could go? Or was there fish and then there was land animals?
A little bit of both. So if you think about what the world looked like pre-Tiktaalik, there were creatures on land. There were plants. There were forests. There were shrubs. There were invertebrate creatures on land. So other creatures had inhabited land. First the plants, then the invertebrates, kind of insect-like creatures. But our distant relatives, creatures with bones and backbones, they were all in water. In fact, their entire history up until that point was in water. So what you had was
I'm going to ask you a question. You just used some particular words, our distant relatives. So you mean that in the way it's sounding like?
Oh, I mean it 100%. I wrote a book called Your Inner Fish,
right.
And I wrote Your Inner Fish for a reason. Because if we trace the fossils, if we trace the embryos, if we trace the DNA, our distant history is in other mammals, is with reptiles, with amphibians, with fish, with worms, with all the rest of life on our planet. We are part of an evolutionary tree that contains the rest of life on the planet. And we see it in our bodies.
Right.
And that's the part of the story here with Tiktaalik that I really love. Because when you talk about the origin of a wrist, which you see for the first time in Tiktaalik and its cousins, when you see the origin of a neck, which you see for the first time in Tiktaalik and its cousins, you're seeing the origin of parts of our own bodies.
That's extraordinary.
It is. And it's extraordinary because we know it from evidence. We know it from data. I could trace the fossils to show, how our wrist is related to the wrist of these fish. I could trace the fossils to show how our neck is related into the neck of these fish. So every time you bend your wrists, every time you shake your head, you could thank these fish living in streams 375 million years ago. And it shows how our bodies contain layer after layer of history. And that history is so important to understand why we look the way we do. Because it doesn't always make sense the way we look the way we do, but history explains so much.
It grabbed something in the human imagination whenever whoever told the first story told it.
Yet this is what writing is, a leaving behind.
I love the seminary co-op.
Let me say how happy I am to be here among my people in the temple of the book.
Insightful, observant, and recorded live at Chicago's world-renowned seminary co-op bookstores, Open Stacks brings you conversations with scholars, poets, activists, and more on subjects as eclectic as the books on our shelves, plus the latest in scholarly publishing and books of endurance with views from the co-op's venerable front table. Join the conversation at semcoop.com or wherever you download podcasts. Open Stacks. Stay tuned. Stay curious.
This idea that we are descendants of fish or fish-like creatures, I imagine created a bit of a stir.
Yeah, I think people are used to. The funny story is, if people have a challenge thinking we're related to monkeys,
right?
Wait till they get a load of the fish. But I love is to tell the story, because when you say you're inner fish, or when you say you were related to fish, it seems so utterly absurd at one level, right? Come on. But the reality is, when you look at the DNA and the DNA we share with fish, when you look at the fossils and you lay them out and connect us to fish, you start to see that not only is that true, but how much of ourselves it explains.
So all of these discoveries and evolutions are fascinating on so many levels. And when you sit down and think of the significance that this discovery actually means among all the things that it can mean, what has been the most compelling thing that made you really just stop and say, this is just quite extraordinary?
Yeah, it's just to show how our world was developed, how history is really important for understanding our world, our present place in the world. That is so much of our bodies, so much of the ecosystem we live on and depend on, so much of our future and the technologies that are just dictating our future. Really, it comes down to understanding history very much to begin to see how that all fits together. So let me break that down a little bit. When you think about the making of our body and why it looks the way it does, history is important, whether it's understanding DNA or fossils. But also if you think about what biomedical science does today, evolutionary history, the kinds of ideas we're talking about become paramount. Think about it this way. Who have Nobel Prizes in medicine and physiology gone to in the last 35 years? They've gone to people working on flies. They've gone to people working on corn. They've gone to people working on mice. 2 Nobel Prizes in the last 11 years have gone to 5 people working on a little tiny worm the size of a comma on a piece of paper. And that worm is telling us on how our genes are turned off in health and disease, how cells are programmed to die, and what goes wrong in diseases like cancer. When you think about understanding the cures to what ails us, from Alzheimer's to different cancers, understanding our connection to the rest of life on the planet becomes important. How are we similar and different from mice? How are we similar and different from that worm? How are we similar and different from the fly? When you think about fish, right here on campus at the University of Chicago, fish are being used as models to understand diabetes, Parkinson's, sleep disorders. Fish. The reason why is because we have a connection to them, because you can see it in the DNA, and they become model systems experimentally to do things that we could never do on humans, for instance. We can really understand their biology and probe it experimentally in ways that we would never do in a human. Obviously.
So we would normally think of that you're going to have rats or mice or other things, but normally you don't think about fish being used in the lab.
Yeah, and they're fabulous models for
any type of particular.
Yeah, there's the fish that's most commonly in laboratories now. Actually, for the last 2 decades, it's been just increasing in its importance. It's one called the zebrafish. The zebrafish is a tiny little fish. We have about 5 labs here on campus that work on it. One lab works on it to model heart disorders in humans, another to look at diabetes, others to look at skeleton and its formation. Mine uses zebrafish as well. It's a wonderful model because they breed very rapidly. You can get lots of embryos. They develop very quickly. You can see through their embryos really beautifully. You can manipulate their genes. You can turn them on and off using certain molecular tools. There's a whole grab bag of techniques you can use to understand them. So people are working on their inner fish every day in DNA labs to understand clinical situations in humans. And I think that's just beautiful. People are doing it with flies, right? Drosophila. When you think about the fruit fly, Drosophila, so much of what we know about genetics, chromosomes, how genes work, came out of that.
You mentioned a few moments ago our futures. And so if we look back at where we've been, we look at what we're studying right now, what does that tell you or give you some insight into what our futures as human beings could end up looking like?
Yeah, I think about that a lot. When you think about where we've been, 3.5 billion years of evolution, that's where we've been. That's where our branch of the tree of life has been. It's really been natural selection, climate change, evolving populations over time. It's been Darwinian evolution. Will the future be Darwinian? Open question. There are certain things that change the game for us as a species. One is we develop tools. We have culture. We have education. We share knowledge with each other. So it's not like the information is going from generation to generation in DNA. In humans, that information, yeah, sure, it goes from generation to generation in DNA. But importantly, it's also shared among people who are living. We share ideas. We share culture, technology. And those can affect human performance. So I like to think of this, if we were to you and I were to take a time machine and, come to Earth in like 20,000 years from now, like get out of the time machine, we look around and we ask the question, what are people looking like and what are they doing? How's their performance? I would think a lot of human performance won't necessarily be based on Darwinian evolution. It'll be based more on human technology, ideas, inventions. We're a species that makes inventions that change the world, for better or for worse. And when you think about human performance, whether it's cognitive performance, lifespan, ability to run or ride a bicycle really fast, you think about pharmaceuticals and technologies, ideas, social practices, all those things will affect human performance. And so it's hard not to think that those things will be main drivers of not only what we can do as a species, but what the differences among us might be.
So does this give you a sense of optimism, pessimism, anything else as you think through where we start going from here?
Yeah, I think I'm a realistic optimist. I think that our powers to solve problems grow ever greater. We make bigger problems for ourselves over time. But I think what gets lost in the world is the transformative power of our ideas to make human lives better. And I think that's been a driving theme. It's not unidirectional. There are big blips, certainly. And we create our own problems, certainly. And the problems we create become ever more dangerous, certainly. But I'm an optimist. It's hard not to be, to look to see what we can do. Look at it this way. The last decade has seen the origin of technologies, gene sequencing technologies, computational technologies, gene editing technologies that take us to look at the human immune systems in certain ways, that diseases that were once thought to be incurable, we're beginning to see the possibility they can either be turned into chronic conditions or indeed be cured. And we're at the cusp of some great stuff in biomedicine. And so it's hard not to be incredibly excited when you look to see what's going on. I just take some of these technologies that are changing the game.
Now, you don't talk, when you're talking like this, like how you normally think a paleontologist would be talking. How did you be able to take such a much more broader worldview?
I've been, throughout my entire career, the most important thing to me as a scientist, as an intellectual, is the question, not the technology, not the technique. So my career has been dominated by thinking about the great questions. And then I would reach out to find what are the best tools to answer those questions. So, we talked about the question, great transformations in the history of life. Well, I trained originally as a paleontologist. That's a great tool. I mean, we could find an intermediate fossil and dig it out and look at it and understand what it tells us about the transitions. But there are other tools that are powerful in their own ways too, DNA, embryos, anatomy, all these things. So if what drives you is the question and you're really athletic about thinking about pulling in the technologies that can answer that question or those questions, then all of a sudden you find yourself at the intersection of all kinds of great science.
Do you have a label for what you do right now? If it was paleontology?
I'm an evolutionary biologist.
Evolutionary biologist.
Yeah, and I think paleontology is a very big part of my approach, but so is molecular biology. So is anatomy.
And speaking of that, you've taught anatomy to medical students.
That's
is that
exactly
right?
where I was going. Yeah, I was like, I was really privileged to teach anatomy here at Chicago. So I came in 2000. I came as chairman of the anatomy department, which is in the medical school. And as soon as I arrived, we had a wave of retirements. And unfortunately, those retirements were some of our best teachers in the department who taught the gross anatomy course, the famous first year, dissect a cadaver, memorize thousands of new names, highly stressful. Well, they had retired. And here I am leading the department. I'm thinking, okay, well, I'm going to have to go in there and teach it myself. So I became the course director. I was always like one step ahead of the students, maybe one lecture ahead. But it was really a remarkable experience for me because I got to see another way of looking at the body, right? I'm used to thinking of it as an evolutionary biologist, how it came about over history. But clinicians look at the body as a working machine, what happens when it breaks apart. And there are two very complementary ways of thinking about the body and its workings. But importantly, it also gave me a perspective to think about a narrative to describe what I do. And that came about in the first weeks of the course, almost every year. The students, you'd hang out over the tables with them, dissecting a cadaver. And they'd almost invariably say, Dr. Shubin, what kind of doctor are you? Be like, are you a neurosurgeon? Are you a cardiologist? I'm like, I know, I'm a fish paleontologist. And they're like, what? I want my money back. But anyway, but it soon became clear that being a paleontologist, and not just any paleontologist, a fish paleontologist, was a very powerful way to teach the basics of human anatomy. Because many of the basic structures we have are in simpler forms in fish and sharks. So I use that in teaching. In fact, many people now have used it in teaching. And that's kind of where the idea for the book, Your Inner Fish, and the TV show began, was really in the medical anatomy lab, saying, why are fish relevant to people? And it becomes very clear they're incredibly relevant. When you think about the wiring of our head, and how our ears and jaws work, all the stuff that you would never think of otherwise. When you break it down, it's kind of mind-blowing.
So let me ask you, all considering, you're still a pretty relatively young man. And you're
so much.
welcome. and you've had some things that careers could be started and finished with and be extraordinarily not only satisfied, but incredibly noteworthy. What do you do next? Where do you look back and say, with all the time I have left, hopefully, this is what I would really love to make sure that I'm putting my energy into?
Well, for me, it's, I love being, where I feel most alive as a scientist is to be at the cusp of discovery. My heart races. All scientists will give you the same thing. Your heart just races. And for me, a lot of that happens in the field. I have a National Science Foundation grant from the U.S. Antarctic program. So we've shifted from the North Pole to the South Pole. We're looking at rocks that are significantly older than the ones that produce Tiktaalik. Now we're looking at the deeper branches of the fish evolutionary tree. I led an expedition there last year, going to go back next year. So we're back in the field. It's, one of the things about being a scientist is there's no lack of problems. There's no lack of questions. You're always refreshed and kept humble by the enormity of the questions that lie in front of you as a scientist. And so that's what keeps it exciting, Antarctica is a whole different gig than the North in many ways. We're at a really fun part of those expeditions. For me, the most fun part is when you're in those early phases and trying to figure out, okay, where is it going to be? We turned a corner in our last season, so we're going to go back next year and hopefully turn another corner on that one. I have a lab that's doing quite a bit with molecular biology. We're looking at the deeper branches of the tree. Where did fish come from? How did they get to worms? How did they come from worms? There's so many lessons to learn, and it's just the questions are never ending. And a life of discovery is a life of surprises, right? And it can be very humbling because, sometimes you discover something and you realize you were completely wrong, and that's never fun, but it keeps you mentally fresh. And if you know how to deal with it, it can be humbling. I mean, like a couple of years ago when we were working on DNA that builds fingers and toes in humans, it turns out that DNA builds the fin rays in fish, which is something, if you were to told me when I was a graduate student, I'd say that's completely impossible because they're different kinds of bones. But that's exactly what we see, and it's incontrovertible. So now that's totally shifted my thinking. We've moved it in a very different direction because of that.
So we'll have you back in another episode a few years down the road here. We're going to hear what next levels of big discoveries have come up with. But you've really lived up to this idea of helping us think through things differently and actually change the way us and all of our listeners are listening. So it's been wonderful having you as a guest. Thanks for staying with us today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Big Brains is a production of the UChicago Podcast Network. To learn more, visit us at news.uchicago.edu and subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and wherever else you get your podcasts. And if you liked Big Brains, you might enjoy another UChicago podcast, Knowledge Applied, taking you inside the research, reshaping everyday life. Thanks for listening.